Pessoal, bom dia. Com imenso prazer hoje que eu estou aqui recebendo uma convidada que já faz um bom tempo também que eu gostaria de ter chamado já aqui para o canal, né? Então eu consegui agora fazer esse agendamento para ter vindo. É a professora Carolyne Larrington, da Universidade de Oxford, que inclusive é um imenso prazer estar aqui com ela, presente, para nós falarmos principalmente das pesquisas dela e de alguns assuntos relacionados à mitologia nórdica, que também já foram trazidos aqui no canal, mas sob a perspectiva das pesquisas da professora Larrington, que é uma autora e pesquisadora de muita excelência nessa área. Ms. Larrington, thank you so much again for accepting the invitation. It's a big pleasure and an honor receiving you here in the Viking World channel. So for start the interview, I'd like to know how to start your interest for searching about Norse mythology, about some aspects of the Viking Age, how you start your interest for that.
Okay, I suppose it all started really when I was about 7 years old, and I used to love reading books about Greek myths. And there was a series of retellings of Greek myths by a British author called Roger Lancelin Green. And when I read all of the books about Greek myths, I read his book, The Heroes of Asgard, which was the first introduction I had to Old Norse myths. And I thought that was really interesting, but then I kind of forgot about it. And then when I was 18, I went to work one summer in Norway for complicated reasons. I was working in a hotel there, and it's where I met the first ever Icelanders that I had never even thought about Iceland before, but here were some Icelanders alive and well. And many of them are still good friends of mine today, 40 years, more than 40 years later. And then when I came back to England, I started studying English at the University of Oxford. And one of the things we had to study was Old English. So I found that quite easy, unlike all of my friends, because I could speak German. And I went along one day to a lecture in my first year, which talked about the connections between Old English and Old Norse, given by Heather O'Donoghue. And I sat there listening to this, and I thought I could study this as part of this course. I could learn all about Odin and Thor and all those people I remember from when I was 7. And I could read the sagas. I could do this. And so I said to my tutor in my college, I want to study Old Norse. And he said, fine, we'll sort it out. And so that was my start. And that was in the summer of 1979, so a very long time ago. But I've never lost my interest in Old Norse since then.
Well, that's very interesting. So you have these contacts with many aspects of literature and with language that you can think, oh, it's amazing to be interesting for the Old Norse, for Norse mythology. That's fantastic. It's a very, very nice beginning in your career.
Yeah, a very strange beginning. If I hadn't gone to Norway, then maybe I would never have become interested in all of this. And in fact, when I finished my first degree, I went to teach English in Japan for a couple of years. And I became very interested in Japanese. But I still loved Iceland and Scandinavia more than Japan. So after 2 years, I said to myself, I have to go back to England. I have to get on with my studies in Scandinavian material, even though Japanese is interesting. No, back to Scandinavia for me.
It's very, very interesting. I have the same ideas about that because I love Japan too, but I am much more of the team of Norse mythology, and
Right.
I'm very present with that. And so, for start our interview, it's a very common questions for many people that How do you start the perception of what is Norse mythology and how the classification of this mythology was, how can I say, was created this named for definition of this is Norse mythology? What is exactly when we define Norse mythology?
Well, when we think about what constitutes Norse mythology, we have to think very clearly about all of the evidence we have from the medieval period and earlier. And of course, the key important thing here is that pretty well anything that was written down by Christians, because writing in the Roman alphabet is a Christian technology. And so we always have to remember when we look at the main text, the most expansive text, like the prose Edda and the poems which we tend to classify as the poetic Edda, that these were collected and written down by people who didn't believe in these gods and who were collecting this material really for antiquarian purposes because they were interested in the past, and particularly because they needed that knowledge of the stories of the past to interpret some of the poetry that was still being composed, the kind of poetry that's called skaldic poetry. But alongside these main texts and some references in sagas of various kinds to some of the Old Norse gods, we have a body of more difficult evidence in a way, in picture stones, in carvings, in small objects which have been found by archaeologists. And it's very tempting quite often to look at these images and say, oh, that must be this god, or this picture on a picture stone must illustrate the scene of the binding of Loki, let's say. But just because you have a figure who is bound up and there are lots of snakes doesn't mean it's Loki. It could be Gunnar from the later heroic poems of the Edda, or it could be a story that we don't know anything about at all. And so one of the things we have to remember with the non-verbal evidence is that there must be a huge, huge number of myths that existed, but which are completely lost and which we have no evidence for at all, apart from this very mysterious pictorial evidence. And besides that, in a kind of intermediate position, we have the evidence from skaldic poetry. Now, skaldic poetry is a kind of court poetry, which was, of course, written down once again by Christians, usually in the 13th century. But because of the complicated structure of skaldic poetry, with rhyme, with alliteration, with half rhyme, it's thought that these poems composed in the 9th, 10th, 11th century by people whose names we know, that these poems have not changed in form. And therefore, what the poems are telling us, usually in allusions, not in great length, about the Norse gods or beliefs about the creation, for example, or how humans were created, or ideas about Ragnarök, the end of the world, that the references we have in skaldic poetry are the closest thing that we can get to real bits of Norse mythology. So that's the broad outline of how we define Norse mythology. It's the stories largely preserved in Iceland because the Icelanders were writing manuscripts, continuing to copy them and hanging on to them from the medieval period onwards. And so when we talk about Old Norse Icelandic mythology, we always have to remember that beliefs and stories might have been quite different in Denmark, where they didn't write anything down except in runic inscriptions, and where they became Christian much earlier. And again, very different in Sweden. What we know of Swedish stories seems to suggest that they were much more interested in Freyr and Freya, but those stories haven't been collected. But the evidence from place names suggests that those gods were important there. And meanwhile, in Norway, and because it was Norwegians who went to settle Iceland, it was the West Norse myths that survived in the Icelandic context.
Oh, this is a lot of interesting, because we have all difference from analyze how this mythology was seen in many locals. We have this much, how can I say, very influence for the Icelandic because of the Eddas and sagas and the manuscripts. But we have sometimes that we have some figures that was very present in the Viking Age in some elements, archaeological elements like the runestones, and in some wood carvings and many aspects of that. And my next question about this is, how do we see the figures of the gods and representations in many aspects, and what we can say that, oh, the figure of Odin is correctly like that, but or no, the others say that Odin is much more apparent like that. How does this implicate for we create an image for the gods in these different contexts?
Well, it's a complicated business for quite a few of the gods, I think. So with Odin, we are quite lucky that we have lots of different pieces of evidence. He's mentioned a lot in the Poetic Edda, where we see him as a god of wisdom, but we also see him as the patron of kings. And so, unlike most of the gods, he actually turns up in the human world. He wanders around, he asks questions, he is there at the end of the hero's life and tells him that his luck has run out and he's going to lose the next battle. So in that sense, he's also a god of warfare, but perhaps not only, he's not the only god of warfare. He's a god of death in some ways, because he sends his Valkyries to determine who's going to go to Valhalla after death. But as well as a god of wisdom, we have lots of information from the sagas and from Snorri's Edda that he's the god of poetry as well. So he has lots of different functions: wisdom, war, poetry, the god of the aristocrats, at least that's what Thor says to him in one poem. And he wasn't the god who was worshipped in Iceland most frequently, that was Thor. It was the poets who seem to have worshipped Odin, and also the kings, because he was the patron of kingship. So we have one quite full description of him at the beginning of Ynglinga Saga, at the beginning of the big historical compilation, Heimskringla. But that is clearly something which has been influenced by contemporary 13th century ideas. So that tells us that Odin was really a refugee from Asia, from Troy, and that he wasn't a god, he was just a very clever person who knew magic, and he could persuade people to worship him. He could change his shape and change into different animals, something that we see in some of the other stories. And the time came when he died, nothing to do with Ragnarok, but just as human beings die. So he died, and then other gods succeeded him, but they were also human. So we have this quite full description of him there, but it's not one that fits exactly with what we learn from the poetry. And the skaldic poetry gives us some details which confirm some of the myths that we learn in Eddic poetry, for example, that he hanged himself on the world tree, Yggdrasil, for 9 days and 9 nights to gain the wisdom of the runes. And were it not that it was in the poem Hálfrúmál, we wouldn't understand some of the strange allusions that we have in skaldic poetry to Yggdrasil as the gallows of Odin, or Odin as having hanged himself. And it's only because we have that story in this one surviving poem, explained across 4 or 5 verses, that we know about that. So in some ways we can say we have quite a full picture of Odin. But what we don't have, I think, at all is a very full picture of Thor. Now, Thor in the myths tends to come across as rather stupid in some ways. He has his great hammer Mjolnir, and he tends to hit people with it and then ask questions later. He spends most of his time away on the borders of the god's territory, fighting against the people who are usually translated into English as giants. But this, I think, is quite a misleading term. So we might prefer to keep the Old Norse term of Jötnar for these people. So he's fighting against Jötnar. He has a wife, he has a family, but in Scandinavian tradition, unlike Odin, who is the patron, but also the ancestor of many kings, going down through both the Norwegian and the Swedish royal lines, Thor doesn't have any children, or he does have divine children, but they don't have human children. So he's not a divine ancestor. And we see him in some of the major stories as very strong, not necessarily very thoughtful, easily deceived by other people. But that can't be all that there is to Thor, because he was the god who was most worshipped in Iceland and in Western Norway. When people went to Iceland and built a pagan temple on their new farms, it was a temple to Thor. He was the default god, if you like. And they incorporated his name in their names. So many people in the sagas are called Thorgeir or Thordis or Thorgrimur or Thorkell. And you still have that Thor element in Scandinavian names today. And that seems to suggest that Thor really was the god who was closest to humans, even if the surviving myths don't tell us very much at all about him interacting with humans. Only in 1 or 2 stories do we see him staying in a human house and then taking the farmer's children away with him because they've broken his goat's leg for complicated reasons. So there's much more to be known about Thor than what we do know, I think. And even more so with Freyr and Freya, who, being perhaps predominantly gods of the East Norse, feature in very few stories. And they must have been important because they're incorporated into place names in Sweden. But somehow we get the sense that Snorri Sturluson, if he was the author of the prose Edda, didn't know enough about them. He'd been to Norway, but he hadn't been to Sweden. He hadn't got Swedish informants to tell him about the traditions of Sweden, let alone Denmark. And so that's why we have such limited information about the gods who are most important there.
It's a very interesting point that you bring, that we can say that Norse mythology born in a different way when the writing aspects are created for the constitution of poems and for the sagas, and comparison of the past vision of the Norse mythology. Example, in the Viking Age, we have some stories that are how can I say, are explicitly not, it's not, we don't have some evidence that all the stories that are writing are in the past. We have some differences that manuscripts told many stories that we don't find sometimes in the archaeological evidence. So how this is implicates to constitute what this is real, or what this is it's created if only in the medieval times for to amplify the stories of Norse mythology. How do you see that?
Well, I think what we always have to bear in mind is we have to think about the sources. And so if we have a story or an idea about one of the figures in Norse mythology, we have to say, how do we know this? And so a very good example here, I think, is that in the Prose Edda, we're told that quite early in the history of the universe, there's a huge flood, and many of the Jötnar are drowned. And just one ancestor survives, and he's floating in some kind of wooden chest, is probably what the word means. And nevertheless, after that, there are still giants, lots and lots of giants who Thor has to go and control. So this giant and his wife presumably survived and then repopulated the earth with giants. But we only have the story about the flood in the Prose Edda, and we have no trace at all of this story in any other source. So what do we make of that? Do we say this is a Christian writer who knows that the way that the number of giants in the world was controlled in the Old Testament, in the Bible, was because God sent a flood and drowned all the simple humans and the giants and the hybrid giant humans. So you were left only with Noah and his sons and the ark, and then all of the animals. Does that mean that the author of the Prose Edda just took the story out of the Bible, changed it around a little, and incorporated it into his account of the early days of the Norse universe? Probably. But it's also the case that we have, across world mythologies, many cases of a great flood. So quite often the universe is created, you have the sun, you have the moon, you have the animals, you have the plants, humans and other human type creatures are created. And then the creator or some other divinity looks at the humans and goes, no, this has gone wrong. I don't like what we have here. We need to start again. A great flood is sent. All the bad humans are got rid of, and then we get a nice line of good humans. That, of course, doesn't explain why there's still evil in the world, which may be a whole other question. But it does show that the flood is quite a universal, not universal, but a very frequent concept in mythologies which have no connection with Judaism or Christianity. So maybe there was a flood. But in some ways, I think it's more likely, since there are no references anywhere else, that the flood was imported. So that's the key thing we have to ask ourselves. Is this something which is widely evidenced across our texts, particularly in the skaldic verse, or is it something that we only have in the Prose Edda? At which point we might think, perhaps this is something that the author of the Edda has invented and put in here because he thinks it should be here. But at the same time, there are things like that story of Odin hanging himself on the tree, which don't appear at all in the Prose Edda. And scholars have suggested that's because a god who hangs himself is uncomfortably close to Jesus Christ on the cross. And so a Christian would automatically want to take that out of the antiquarian stories that he was rehearsing, so that nobody, even if they were good Christians, would make that equivalence between Christ and Odin, who are two very different characters in Christian thinking. because what we tend to find in some of the later sagas is that Odin still exists, but he's a demon. He's been sent by the devil to tempt kings to do wrong things, unchristian things. And then you have to treat him as you would any other demon. Ignore him, don't follow his advice, and then he'll go away in the end. So you can see how with that new kind of definition of Odin that you don't want him starting to look like Christ on the cross.
Oh, that's a lot of interesting that you say. I was learning that now with you that I really don't have idea that Odin was changing to be a bad person in some aspects of Christianity in comparison of perspectives of in the Old Norse religion, and this is very, very interesting to analyze this.
Yeah, it's a problem for Christian writers to deal with the gods of the past, the pagan gods. Obviously, they're not really gods because there is only one God, who's the Christian God. So they must either have been humans pretending to be gods, which is this belief called euhemerism, which is quite widespread. And it's what we find in Ynglinga saga when we're told that Odin was really this refugee from Troy. But if the gods were not humans, then they must be something else. And the something else must then be diabolical, something sent by the devil. And in some kinds of writing, particularly in the king sagas, in the more historical sagas, but also in some of the legendary sagas too, the Fornaldarsögur, you find Odin turning up and suggesting that some hero should do something really bad, just operating as a tempter, just like Satan. And there you can see that his function is to teach a moral lesson to the king. And sometimes the king understands what's going on, particularly if his bishop is there and the bishop says, no, don't do that. But sometimes the king will take some notice and then things can go quite badly wrong.
Oh, this is interesting thing to analyze because when we have some aspects of like the government of Harold Bluetooth, we have these how can I say, we have this man that probably was in a step that to conversion of the Christianity in the territory of Denmark and Norway, but sometimes he have this thinking of I am have a past with Odin, and we try to see that he probably don't forget totally his costumes, but he make some type of syncretism when he did this. The rune stone that he put aspects of the Jesus crucified, but it's when you see it's very similar to Odin in the Yggdrasil when we saw the rune stone that he made to harmonize his to make an can I say I would like to have the term to glorify the past of his mother and father, and we saw that these stones, and we saw that how much this king have not forget his past in this, and this is interesting to see the syncretism.
Yes, and I think there is a fair amount of syncretism, usually of gods into demons, rather than saying that the pagan gods are at all like the Christian god, which is why we have, I think, a suppression of this story about Odin hanging himself. But the god who is in conflict with the Christian god in the Icelandic conversion stories is usually Thor. And so when the bishop's ship sinks as he's sailing around Iceland, the woman who makes a satirical verse up about it contrast Thor and Jesus. Jesus didn't save the ship. Thor sent a storm and attacked the ship, and he was stronger than Jesus. So that's not really syncretic because it's oppositional. But it's interesting to see, again, in light of what I was saying about the importance of Thor, that you don't very often in the conversion stories get Odin and Jesus going head to head. It's always Thor, or almost always Thor and Jesus.
Oh, that's very, very a lot of interesting. And we can have some, how can I say, I just put it in the figure of Odin and Thor. We both know that the figure of these two gods are very important for the period, and many people have Thor as a protector and have Odin as a protector in some aspects. We have the other gods, but these two are, I think, you are very, very, how can I say, very contemplated by populations in the Viking Age. How you can say about how much the influence of the gods like Odin and Thor have in this population? We can say that Odin is the principal god, or Thor is much more important. What we can say about these two gods and his importance for these populations in that period?
Well, the evidence in the later text seems to suggest that Odin is the god of the elite, of the aristocrats, of the poets. And Thor is the god of ordinary people, and particularly in Iceland and in Norway, he's the god of farmers and he's the god of seafarers because he controls the weather. And that's really important for the main bulk of the people. Now, presumably women had their own particular views. Did women worship Thor? Who knows? Were they more interested in worshipping Freya or Frigg, for example, or some of the other goddesses? I can't think of any particular examples where human women invoke Thor. And we find all of these Thor's hammers as archaeological items. Who was wearing them? We assume it was men. And when we find them in places where there are a lot of Viking raids, we think, oh, yeah, it was probably men were wearing them just as Christians wore a cross around their neck. Men were wearing Thor's hammers for protection. Were women that interested? Did they have other kinds of amulets? Quite likely, I think, to get divine protection. So I think it depends a lot from place to place. But I think actually, if we're looking at numbers, more people were worshipping Thor or depended on Thor or invoked Thor, asked for his help and wore symbols relating to Thor than there were people who principally wanted to worship Odin. So that's a kind of numbers game. You always will have more peasants than aristocrats, more farmers than aristocrats. But what was going on in East Norway, what was going on in Denmark is a whole other question. And what women were doing and what slaves were doing. If you're a slave, then you may not be Norse at all. You may have come from the British Isles, or you may have come from Eastern Europe. So you may have a whole different system of worship that has nothing to do with the Norse pantheon. So I think the whole picture of religion and belief in the Viking Age is much more complicated than most popular books would lead us to believe.
It's a curious because we have many types of cults in the Viking Age. We can say that we don't have only one religion, but many in that time.
Yeah.
And this is interesting because we saw these differences of the influence of the gods in many aspects. One example that I love to to say. It's when we watch, I think you have seen this with the Norsemen, and we have this fight of different gods that not Odin and Thor, but is Odin and Frey.
Prayer, yeah.
Because the uncle prefer much more Frey, and the how can I say, Amleth is much more for Odin because of his family is a very aristocratic family and prefer much more this aspect of the a god that was as you say, that produced many other kings. They are descendants of this god. And it's interesting fight because we don't see much this aspect of this combat like Fury and Odin, and this is a contrast that's very interesting that the movie bring, because we saw much more Thor and Odin dispute this place, but when we think that a god of associated with fertility and a god associated with war is very very interesting point to see in this.
Yeah, and you can see in that movie how presumably originally the uncle is of the same family, of the same blood, and he was a raider. When we see him at the beginning of the film, he's been raiding, so he may have been an Odin worshipper before, but once he becomes a farmer in Iceland, then Freyr is the most important figure. And we find this in a couple of sagas. I said that worship of Thor is the kind of default option. That's what most people do. But we do have in Hrafnkel saga, in Vatnsdæla saga, specific chieftains who are absolute devotees of Freyr. And you can see how in the film, the director, Robert Eggers, taking advice from the consultants, the historical consultants, has tried to make a real distinction between Freyr worship and Odin worship. Odin worship is all about blood, it's about killing, it's about being one of the Ulfhednar, one of these elite warriors that Amleth belonged to. It's about this kind of frenzy before you kill, and it also, of course, entails the belief that the Valkyrie will come for you and take you to Valhalla at the end, and that death in battle is the most important thing. And set against that, you have the uncle, Fjolnir, wanting to settle down in Iceland, wanting to grow his farm. He needs to have slaves to work his farm. He wants status with the other chieftains, so they play the ball game and so on. And he gives his son a ship burial. Now, whether a ship burial is particularly related to Freyr, there's no evidence for that. But the director says that he wants to have a clear distinction between burial in a mound, like the undead person with the sword, and a ship burial, or a kind of burial by fire, and that these are, one is Odinic and one is Freyr. That's one of the differences he wants to make.
Oh, it's interesting. I didn't know that. I think that he creating a contrast, just his of really his own vision for the film, for to create a dispute by a god that is not much more associated with the strongness and the with the battles, and to dispute with Odin, that was a god that was considered the how can I say, the term of Allfather and the government of Asgard. And this is he put this dispute to say Fjolnir is not only a person that was he is considered the villain in the movie, but he's a person that suffered in some point. He was a bastard from a woman that probably was a slave. and he is born in a context totally different from the brother. The brother is created in the ambience of the aristocratic ambience, and Fiona know much more this part of goddess that was related more of people that not only in the high status. And this is very interesting to solve this contrasts
Yeah,
in in Viking Age and the mythologies that they put in the movie.
yeah, and I think I think you're right to say Eggers is mostly relying on his own vision and particularly his instinct as a filmmaker to have two very different, opposed ideas. But in a way, there's no need to have so much religion in the film. You could just have the story of Hamlet with no religion in it at all. But because he was really interested not only in action, but in thinking, in culture, in the system of beliefs that people had, he really works hard to try to create that with all of the detail that you have in the temple on Frappensee, for example, or the fact that the figure of Odin appears from time to time, or at least one time in the film when Amleth is hanging in the barn, and then you have other Freya kind of motifs as well. So I think what Robert Eggers has done in the film is a really interesting dive into a reimagined, not I think a historically accurate, but a wonderfully reimagined idea of what the Viking Age might have been like.
Yeah, I totally agree. For me, it's the best movie of Viking Age. In actual days, is the best movie that they made. Um, we can say that we have some dispute that what is how can I say what is correct or no, and this is a dispute like what is the existence of three or Freya? They are both or not, or they are different gods. This is a question that many people want to know about these two goddesses.
Yeah, well, I think back in the late 70s and the 80s, there was a kind of frame of mind in world mythology, that at least European mythology, that wanted to suggest that all the goddesses were in some ways a version of the one great goddess. And they could all be seen as aspects of this single figure, the virgin, the mother, the crone, the old woman, but they were all a single figure. And I've always resisted that, even back in the 80s, the idea that male gods can be very different, and they have different personalities, different stories, but all the women are all the same. You can just smush them all together. And I think that's to flatten out women. So for me, I think Frigg, whose name appears in Old English as well, who we have in Friday, of course, is very clearly a maternal goddess, the wife of Odin, queen of the gods, if you like, but at least important in that story of the myth of Balder, for which we don't have a huge amount of other evidence. And then we have Freya, who doesn't appear outside the north and whose name just means lady, but is a goddess of love, of beauty, of sexuality, and of fertility as well, very likely. And so I think there's plenty of room in the Old Norse imaginative universe for two goddesses with different functions, because both of them seem to have this flying suit, this Valhammer. Sometimes it belongs to Frigg, sometimes it belongs to Freya, and they don't seem to use it. They just lend it to Loki from time to time. So there are things that unite them, but Freya has this mysterious function of taking half of the dead. And if she is the same as the goddess Sawa, with whom Odin drinks every day in Sökvabekur, then Odin and Freya are two sides of the death deities. And which half of the dead is it that Freya is taking? Is she taking the women and sending them off off to hell? Does she have a separate realm for her dead? Are all of the heroic dead going to Valhalla with Odin? These are things we very much like to know the answer to, and things which modern retellers of the stories are very interested in unpacking. But yes, for me, I think they're two quite different figures.
That's a very interesting point, because I saw people that sometimes defend that they are the same, because don't see that in some manuscripts they say that don't have phrase. Sometimes free only appear and have some same characteristics, and we have the game like God of War, that many people that see that Freya was associated with wife of Odin, and many people create this idea too. And this is interesting, that point that you bring us, because sometimes this can be very confusing when we have these other aspects and creativities of that were created for media, like the video games. And
So Zack Snyder's Twilight of the Gods, for example, has got rid of Frigg, and Freya is Odin's wife there. And for reasons of plot, that's quite useful, because she is of the Vanir and seems to be married to Odin to resolve the Aesir-Vanir war, but she's the queen in Ausgardr, but her sympathies are with the Vanir. And you can see how, from the point of view of plot dynamics, that's very useful.
Yeah, that's a lot very, very interesting to see these 2 points. And I think I have to agree with you. For me, I think it's two different persons in my perspective for that, because I think have some different aspects from these two goddess. And I think Free was much more definite with probably, if this story is correct, mother of Baldur, and associated with other things in comparison of Freya. I think don't have much evidence that Freya was used from accord with Vani and Aesir. I think it is much more a vision that we created much more years.
Much later. I think that's a convenient modern fiction, but there's so much we don't know about that war. What we learn in Völuspá is that this figure, Heiðr, is burned 3 times, and yet 3 times she revives. And then the war between the Aesir and the Vanir starts, and the Vanir have the capacity to regenerate themselves. So you can see how you can put all of those together and make a story like the God of War story, or the Twilight of the Gods story. And it works pretty well in the logic of particularly, as you say, game logic. Why you have to have fighting? Why are these groups fighting each other? And so that logic works quite well. But of course, in the myths, you have a little bit of tension between Freya and Odin. So, for example, in Sökvabekur, when Odin wants to get the Brísinga men from Freya in order to make her do something, to start this endless war, the Hjarningavig, in order to make more heroes to come to Valhalla for him. So you can see the logic there. And you can see a kind of tension between Odin and Freya there, which, although that story seems to be quite a late one, maybe if they're two deities of death, maybe that tension was always there in some way.
Yeah, this is a very good observation about that. Because we saw these goddess are very fluently in these stories, and this is a very point to analyze, because many people have this doubt about this story, and we really comprehend we have that these two goddess that sometimes people think, oh, one in two, but you are completely right about this aspect. And we have a god that became very popular in nowadays. Marvel uh, love this god, I think, now much more than Thor, and people love to see his series. That's god is Loki. And Loki is a god that we can say that he has now many multiple faces. To Light of the Gods bring a very interesting aspect of Loki, that we can saw that he have sentimentals much more. He is the god of, how can I say, the god of that makes sometimes some tricks with persons that, and but he, how can I say, he gods of the that shit sometimes persons, but he have feelings in some aspects of the series. He cry, he feels sorry, sadness for how he family was treated. And no, this is really correct about this god. Loki really is a person that have some in, how can I say, he feels something for the other people that sometimes he hurt or no, he the gods that don't really care with himself, doesn't care about anything. What you can say about suspects of this god?
Well, I think when I was young, when I was reading these books when I was 7 years old, Loki was a bad guy, and there was no doubt about it. And he might be a trickster, he might be quite amusing, but ultimately he was just wrong. He was going to side with the Jötnar Ragnarök, and he was the father of these monsters. So there was no sympathy for him. But you're absolutely right that partly because of the Marvel universe and mostly the films, I think, not the original comic books, Loki has become a much more sympathetic figure. And in some ways, well, the British author A.S. Byatt, who writes about him in her book Ragnarok, says that when she read the myths as a child, she liked Loki the best because he was clever. He thought about things. Now, I think Odin thinks a lot as well. Odin thinks, Odin worries. Odin goes around trying to find out what's going to happen in the future. Can it be changed? Is it fixed? But Loki is also the kind of god of narratives, because he goes through the myths going, what would happen if I did this? Oh, look, that was interesting. Let me just borrow this flying suit and fly over to Jotunheim. What will happen as I'm flying over Jotunheim? Oh, I get caught by a giant and shoved in a box for 3 months. And then now I have to bring Idun with her apples into Jotunheim. So it's this kind of probing, inquiring, experimental version of Loki, which I think has really captured people's imagination. Along, and I think maybe this is a particularly American development, along with the idea of Loki, the family man. Now, Loki has a wife, Sigyn, among the Ausinir, among the goddesses. But he has this relationship with the giant Angurbodha, and he has these three children, the wolf, the world serpent, and Hel. And in quite a few modern retellings, Loki isn't a great father to them. He's not hanging about, bringing them up and teaching them things. But when the gods decide to bind Fenrir, to throw the world serpent into the ocean, to send Hel down to hell, Loki doesn't like that because those are his children. And also because he thinks if the gods will treat my children like this, sooner or later, they will be binding me. And he's right, of course, and he provokes his binding through his behavior over around the death of Baldur. But that has also rehabilitated him. You're right to say that Loki is now the person with feelings. And we also have in the sources as well this kind of sexually ambivalent Loki. We have Loki who can turn himself into a mare, which is the most stigmatized of animals to be associated with a man in Old Norse culture. And not only a mare, but a mare who has sex with a stallion and has a baby. And then we have him becoming pregnant by eating a witch's heart and giving birth to to ogresses and witches of various kinds, as well as having a wife and fathering sons and fathering monsters. So he's in this, and cross-dressing, of course, in the story in Thrymskviður. So we have this very interestingly up-to-date idea of Odin, of Loki, sorry, as a figure with a very different attitude to sexuality from what we find in the very kind of dichotomous Thor is a man and acts like a man, even though that's a story that's unpacked when he has to dress as a woman to get his hammer back. So Loki is attractive in all kinds of ways because of this. And also, and I think a kind of extension of this is the way that nowadays, and maybe God of War has something to do with this, but I think God of War picked up something that was already in the zeitgeist, if you like, that the Aesir in the Old Norse sources, the Aesir are written as the good guys. And for Tolkien, for example, they were brave, they were noble, they knew that they were all going to die, they faced their deaths like men. But now people are asking, were the Aesir really good? Were they noble? They broke their oaths to the giants. Did the giants not have a point that the Aesir were always stealing things from them or oppressing them in different ways? Isn't it time the reign of the Aesir was overthrown? And you can see this already in the 19th century in Wagner, where by the end of the Ring, Valhalla is going up in flames, Yggdrasil is burning down, the gods are finished, and now it's the time for humans. And so there's a sense in which Ragnarök is figured not just as the end of the world, but the end of the gods. And the point at which a kind of modern sensibility, we don't need gods anymore. We're humans. We can make our own laws. We can work out our fates for ourselves. That kind of thinking, which is in some sense sort of modern 19th century thinking, that's also one of the meanings that we now read out of Ragnarök.
Oh, that's very interesting to see that Loki have many faces in this story, and we saw that we can say that he have a part in him in some sentimentals, but he was, I think, a very careful person in to say the gods. It's can be a friend of me, but sometimes he can be my enemy, and I think he was a very, how can I say, um he can say a person be cautious with
Yeah.
in some aspect. And this is an interesting point that you bring, because uh many of people and many of us see that Loki was, or only he was good or he was bad. We definitely in two aspects, but I think he have much more of
Yeah.
not only good and bad. He is more complex that we really know.
Yeah, he has many different functions. So sometimes he's just the enemy. But I think A.S. Byatt's idea of him as the god who makes things happen, who makes stories happen, is a really useful one, because so often the myths start with Loki was doing this, or Loki did that, or Odin and Loki are going somewhere with Heinir or someone, and then this thing happens. The whole story of the Rheingold starts with Loki throwing a stone at an otter. Why? Because he wanted the otter skin, but it starts a whole chain of story afterwards. And I think that's something which is Loki's kind of unique contribution, if you like, to the mythological system, is the generator of stories.
Oh, that's a very nice to saw that many points of this character that was very contemplated nowadays, because of his how can I say, he have a little stereotype of being seen very, how can I say, um sometimes he is the exotic guy in these situations. He was very sometimes he really I say that sometimes he's a pretty like the Joker in the Batman sometimes, because of these types of um how can I say, he smile a lot, or he sometimes to want to make a trick with persons. And this is a very interesting point of Loki. And for our last question, I would like to asking you. I think that was a really interest to bring when we have these two events like Ginnungagap and the event of Ragnarok, that the beginning and the end of the world. Some points that we can say that this is much more a Christian conception of Norse mythology, or this is really are related to the Old Norse religion.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. In some ways, the way that the story of creation begins in the Prose Edda, where it's a kind of chemical reaction between ice and fire. You have Muspelheim, and you have the primordial ice, and this Ginnunga gap in between, and the steam from the melting ice kind of crystallizes and then makes the man, the Buri, and then you have the cow and all that kind of thing. I think it's probably right to say that the idea of the beginning of everything as this kind of meeting of two physical forces is exactly what was going on in Christian learned thinking in Europe in the 13th century. If I mean, obviously, Christian learned thinking says the universe comes about because God says, "Let there be light," and so that's a creation from nothing, ex nihilo creation, which is a different kind of creation from the emergence of order out of chaos, of cosmos out of chaos. But nevertheless, scientific thinking was thinking along those lines in the 13th century. But at the same time, if you look across world mythologies, you find any number of mythologies where there are there's nothing. Quite often it's just water. And then something happens, maybe a god spits or vomits, or sometimes the god defecates, and you get some matter, and the matter gets bigger and bigger. Then you have earth, and then you have the sea. And then sometimes a figure emerges and starts shaping things, moving things around, making more matter to make the earth. And so it's not impossible that that kind of chemical model was also present in pre-Christian thinking, since we do find it in quite a lot of other mythologies too. At the same time, the idea of a Ragnarok, the destruction of the world, is quite, and the gods as well, the idea that the gods can die is quite unusual in world mythology. And that question of whether once Ragnarok has been achieved and everything is dead and the universe is destroyed, will it come back again? Now, some people have argued that when in Old Norse myth you have a new earth rising out of the sea, and you have some of the gods coming back, Baldur comes back, the second generation, Modi, Magni, they find the gold chess pieces in the grass, the eagle flies across the waterfall, that this is a version of Christian thinking. This is the new heaven and new earth of the book of Revelation. And I think that might be the case. But at the same time, in Hindu myth, we have a succession of ages in which the earth comes about, things happen, and then it's destroyed, and then there's rebirth, and everything starts up again. So you have a kind of cycle of reincarnation, which living things are trying to escape in a way so that they can get out of this cycle and become their immortal selves. So I'm not 100% sure that the idea of a new heaven and a new earth isn't something that was always present in Old Norse myth, that that kind of progress towards Ragnarok and the end of everything needed some kind of counterbalance to give us hope that perhaps even if the world is destroyed or comes close to destruction, we can make a better place, having learned lots of valuable lessons. Maybe that is an integral part of Old Norse thinking, but it's quite hard to evidence it from outside Völuspá, the Ceres' prophecy, and texts like the Prose Edda, which are closely related to that poem. So I'm less sure that, well, I'm sure that Ragnarok is inherent in Viking Age thinking. Whether the rebirth of the universe is so inherent, I'm rather more doubtful.
It's there. So we can say that Ginnungagap probably are related to the old Norse religion perspective, but Ragnarok is much more closely to the Christian perception.
Maybe. I mean, what tends to happen in other mythologies is that quite often, as we have with these stories of the flood, the idea that the first attempt at setting up the world has gone wrong and we need to wipe it out and start over again comes much earlier in the story. After that, everything is sorted out. God says he will never destroy humans again. Human society flourishes, and everything is kind of fine. And it's only, I think, in Indian myth and in Norse myth that we have this sense of the world being destroyed by fire. And in Indian myth, yet it's reborn and the cycle starts up again. And I rather suspect a kind of Christian eschatology has shaped the coming back of the earth. But I think Ragnarok it's baked into the kennings in such a way, the idea that the wolf is looking at the homes of men, that Ragnarok will come one day, and that the earth is doomed in some way. There are not so many references to it, but I think there's enough for us to think that, along with the myth of Valhalla, obviously, that Viking Age people did believe in end times, but not necessarily about new times after that.
Oh, that's a very interesting point about this two sides of the story, because some researchers or some about this situation, some says that Ragnarok brings many conceptions that are more closely to the perception of Christianity, like have an
Yeah,
end
sure.
and
Yeah,
have
it
a
looks
new
like the Last
beginning.
Judgment. It looks a bit like the Last Judgment. It certainly looks like the Book of Revelation, but what it doesn't really have is judgment. It has fate. So in Christian thinking, everybody has to come before Christ, and the sinners will go to hell and the elect will go to heaven, and it's all individual. But in the Old Norse tradition, that's it. Everyone's gone. Except maybe you have these figures hiding in the woods, maybe hiding in Yggdrasil, who are able to start the world up again. And we do have an idea that humans are going to survive in Vafthrûdnismál, for example, and not so clearly the case in Völuspá, where a second generation of gods comes back. But it's normally Völuspá that's linked to this kind of Christian apocalyptic tradition. And I think the idea that humans might survive, but the gods don't, which is closer to what we find in Vafthrûdnismál, is more akin to the kind of modern idea that the age of the gods is over and it's time for humans to take responsibility for their own fates.
Oh, that's fantastic. You know, these different ideas that of converse, that we have these types of the Norse Old Norse mythology that pass with these times, that probably have this relationship with the Christian perspective. Fantastic. These 2 points of analyze these stories. Miss Carolyne, I'd like to thank you so much for being here, for doing this interview. Just for our end this, I'd like to know if you have some tips of books that you would like to share with people here in the channel, that you like to recommend, that you think that, oh, this is very interesting for study Norse mythology, because it's a subject that many people are very interested nowadays because of series, movies. You can advise your books that you think that is interesting.
Well, I suppose I have to recommend my own books in some ways. So my book, The Norse Myths, has been translated into Portuguese. So yeah, there's that. My latest book on the Norse myths, The Norse Myths That Shape the Way We Think, which hasn't been translated, and which came out 2-3 years ago, is concerned with how the Norse myths signify in different ways today. And it doesn't, of course, take account of things like the Northman well, actually, there's a little bit about the Northman because I just had time to put the Northman in there, but it doesn't talk about some recent TV shows like Ragnarok, the Norwegian TV show that was on Netflix, or Twilight of the Gods. Then there's my translation of the Poetic Edda, which is the best translation, I think, of the poems that we find in the Codex Regius, plus some related material. And then I would recommend to English speakers going to the Viking Society for Northern Research's website and looking for Anthony Falk's translation of the Prose Edda, which is an extremely good translation. You can download it completely for nothing. And that's the one that I would really recommend. It has good notes and useful introduction as well. So that would be my starting point. Anything that's got my name on it, plus Anthony Falk's from the Viking Society website.
Oh, amazing. I have your book and I love this book. Is perfect. For people that are here in the channel, search for in Brazil Editora Vozes that have this book of Miss Carolyne Larrington that was amazing. In English is The Norse Myth, A Guide to the Gods and Heroes, and in Portuguese, let me only check here what was the name in Portuguese of the book, just from you remember.
I can't remember what it was called. It's something like the Norse myths or something, isn't it?
Yes. Here is Os Mitos Nórdicos, um guia para os deuses e heróis.
Yeah, there we are.
Portuguese. Yes, it's the same translation. I was only want to confirm if it's the same name of the English version. Is the same name just in Portuguese. Is so searching for Editora Voz here in Brazil that have this amazing book, and the cover is fantastic. It's
a good cover, isn't it?
Yeah, with some draws that was related to archaeological things that were related to the gods, and that's amazing. The cover, I love this cover. So thanks so much, Miss Carolyne. It's amazing receiving you here.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to have the chance to talk about Old Norse myth, and I hope everybody's enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. I will just stop the recording.